Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about three powerful supplements that I believe everyone should use, whether they be beginners, intermediate, or advanced lifters. In this episode, I'm going to talk about each of these supplements individually and what they do, why I take them personally, and how you could see a benefit from these. The first compound that we're going to take a look at is probably one that you're familiar with, and that's going to be creatine, more specifically creatine monohydrate. The monohydrate just represents a form of this creatine molecule. Now, creatine's interesting because it's one of the most studied supplements out there. There's plenty of literature looking at creatine and its safety, but at the same time, I think it's one of the most misunderstood supplements as well. A lot of people think that it's some sort of magic bullet or steroid that's going to magically make you instantly stronger, and that's not necessarily the case, although it is proven to have some benefits with little to no side effect at all. So I would first like to look at how this molecule works on a fundamental basis. I find that a lot of people don't actually understand what creatine is doing. And if you can understand this, then you can understand, okay, this is why it is one of the major supplements that actually work. Because in the industry, let's be honest, a lot of supplements don't do anything at all. Okay? Um, so how creatine works, and to understand this, right, you have to understand the energy systems of the body. And through cellular respiration, where your body is processing and utilizing energy for you to do your daily activities, whether it be lifting weights, running, exercising, etc., or even me in front of the screen right now, you are utilizing ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. So if I were to draw this ATP, I'm going to draw it very simplistically. I have my adenosine, and then I have three phosphate groups attached to that adenosine, right? Hence adenosine triphosphate. Okay? Now, what your body does, and this is a very interesting process, your body will latch onto one of these phosphate groups and disconnect it. And whenever it pulls this phosphate off, there is a release of energy. And this is what you are actually utilizing as you're doing any sort of activity, right? That's why ATP is sometimes just called energy, because that's what we're utilizing it for. Now, when this happens, what gets left behind is called ADP, right? Adenosine diphosphate. It has two phosphate groups now instead of three, because you use that. Now, because there's only two phosphates on there, it is much harder to pull another phosphate group off to get another energy release. So before your body can use this molecule again, it needs to replace this third phosphate, right? So it needs to put another phosphate group back on. And this is where creatine comes in, right? For creatine, the actual molecule, and it's much more complicated of a molecule than this, but I'm going to simplify it, right? It's otherwise known as creatine phosphate. So there is a phosphate group attached to this creatine, and your muscles store this creatine phosphate in order to pull the phosphate group off and replace that onto your ADP storages, which allows you to create more ATP, which then can be used for energy, right? And that's the magic of creatine, right? It's just an energy storage molecule. So now that we understand what creatine is doing in your body as a molecule, let's go ahead and take a look at, what are some potential sources? What would I dose per day? And what are some potential side effects that we could run into? So the first thing that I like to look at, because I am a bit of a minimalist whenever it comes to supplements myself, is how can I get this in my diet to begin with? And one of your best sources of creatine is going to be red meat. Now, where the difficulty comes in, and you can get varying amounts per amount of red meat, but in order to get 1 gram of viable creatine for your body, you're going to have to eat something around a pound of red meat, right? So if we look at the dose for the highest effectiveness of this supplement, 5 grams daily is going to be a lot of red meat. And that's why using this as a supplement can be a big deal, because most people do not eat enough red meat to get the amount of creatine in their system to have the best performance, right? So you can get this from red meat, but a supplement can really help you hit this 5 grams per day mark. I do want to make a note with the dosage. You'll hear people say you have to load creatine. The idea behind that is you take more at the beginning of taking the creatine to saturate your muscles. There have been conflicting results on if this works or not. Me personally, I do not load my creatine. I just stick with 5 grams a day, and you will hit that saturation point eventually and possibly save money along the way. And then lastly, I want to take a look at the side effects that you might have. And one of the big ones that you hear talked about is this idea of water retention. And people tend to think that one of the goals of creatine is water retention, or they think that the creatine made them gain weight because they're gaining that much muscle mass. That's not necessarily the situation here. Most of this water retention is because creatine, if you can imagine a solute in water, right? The best example I like to give is salt, right? If you're drinking a lot of salt and you're dehydrated, what's going to happen? You're holding on to that salt and it brings the water into your cells, so you'll feel bloated. Most of us understand how that feels to feel bloated after eating something salty. Creatine does something very similar. You're bringing a solute into your cells, the creatine. That way your muscles can use that solute for energy, but it's there nonetheless. So to find balance in the system, your cell's going to bring in more water, right? So that's why you're going to see some water retention with creatine monohydrate, right? Now, this is not a bad thing, right? You want to stay hydrated always as athletes. That's what we should do first and foremost. But understand this is a thing, but this is why, right? You're just getting more water in your muscles because you have more solutes in your system, much like eating a salty diet. All right, so with that said, that's creatine. Let's go ahead and move on to our second supplement. For our second supplement that we have here, this is another common one, right? And this is caffeine. Now, I'm willing to bet that you all are familiar with caffeine. You've probably had it in your day-to-day life. So you may be thinking to yourself, oh, I already understand the supplement. Now, with this, in my experience, I see that people just kind of take it for granted that some things have caffeine and some things don't, and they just go through their daily life taking whatever is in a bottle or a drink that they may be consuming. Now, where you can really optimize your performance with caffeine is by monitoring your dosage and how many milligrams of caffeine you have before working out and throughout your daily life in order to optimize when we're using this compound. Now, just like creatine, I do want to go through how it works very briefly. Basically, caffeine is going to interact with these things called adenosine receptors in your brain. 2 of these to be more specific. The first one's going to be the A1 receptor, and that's going to influence your tiredness, right? So if you've taken caffeine, most of us understand, hey, it's going to make you feel more awake. And then the second receptor influences dopamine, which is essentially that feel-good chemical in your brain. So it gives you that kind of nootropic effect where you really enjoy how you're feeling. It'll bring your mood up. Now, the difference with these two is the A1 receptor does not tend to build up as much of a tolerance as the A2 receptor. So whenever people say they have a tolerance to caffeine, they are talking specifically about this feeling. You need to take more and more in order to feel the same dopamine effect, but it'll still help with the tiredness nonetheless. And that's how you get people who, drink tons of coffee throughout the day. It's still helping them with their tiredness, but they may feel this effect less and less. So just like creatine, let's take a look at, where can we get caffeine in our diets? What dosage is going to be most effective for our strength gains? And what are some potential side effects that we may feel with our use of caffeine? So like creatine, caffeine can be somewhat difficult to get in a regular diet. And that's a hallmark of why I think these supplements can be very helpful, because usually we don't have these in our everyday diet. Now, common sources might be through tea or coffee, and then as we know, it's going to be in sodas and energy drinks and things like that as well. So you do not have to specifically take like a caffeine capsule if you regulate your caffeine that way. Now, I find that it's harder to monitor your dosage and your intake if you are just using something like coffee or tea, because it's less specific in how much caffeine you're actually getting. Now, dosage is probably the biggest misconception that I see, and where people could probably see stronger effects from caffeine. I will link the study below, right? But there have been several clinical studies that have looked at strength performance and caffeine dosage. And this 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight tends to be that kind of optimal range for strength. And this is going to be 30 to 60 minutes before you do your exercise. You would take this amount in. Now, obviously, the larger person that you are, you're going to be able to take more caffeine. That's why it's per kilogram body weight. There's no set amount like that creatine. And you're going to have to find somewhere in this range for yourself, what makes you feel the best personally. But sometimes I find that people are on the low end of caffeine usage and they're afraid to use certain amounts. So consider this. Check out the link that I have below after the video if you're curious about this dosage. Now, going down to side effects, this one has substantially more than creatine. So for that reason, I suggest you regulate your caffeine use a little bit more and you monitor and maybe take breaks occasionally. But some of these side effects could be blood pressure changes, especially if you have a tendency to have high blood pressure. You need to be careful with this because it's going to raise that blood pressure. Some people might feel jitters, but that would come down to your dosage, right? So too high of a dosage could lead to that kind of like shaky feeling like they need to do something. It might also make you feel a little bit sick. And then this tolerance aspect, the more caffeine you take on a regular basis, the more tolerant you're going to be, and therefore the more caffeine you have to take. So really pay attention to these things, but if utilized properly, this can be one of the most powerful supplements as in your arsenal as a strength athlete. All right, for our final supplement that I think is essential as a strength athlete, that's going to be a good old multivitamin. So this might be a little anticlimactic for most of you, but I think a good multivitamin is a solid foundation for healthy training. And it really comes down to this idea of macro versus micronutrients. As serious lifters, we have a tendency to really focus on these macros, right? The protein, carbs, and fats that we take in throughout the day. And with those diets, sometimes, especially if you have a tendency not to like greens or fruits and vegetables, your micronutrients get neglected. So that's going to be all of your vitamins and minerals, ranging from vitamin A, all of the different types of vitamin B, vitamin C, right? Vitamin D, all of those, they're going to have different use cases in your body as far as helping your immune system, helping your energy systems, helping the health of things like your eyes and hair, right? All of that's going to come from micronutrients. And especially if you don't eat things like your leafy greens, a multivitamin can help make up for some of these that you might be lacking. So a multivitamin is much more simple than the other two supplements we talked about, but as long as you find that it has a nice broad range of these micronutrients, then you should be in good shape. And I just like to find one that I can take once daily to supplement my diet. Now, I do want to mention that you can get all of these micronutrients through a proper balanced diet. So if you are diligent about what you eat, you do not necessarily need this as much as possibly the other two. But I think it's a good mention for a balanced lifter's lifestyle, because our goal is not just to be strong in the short term, but to also be strong for years and years to come. And this overall health is going to help that. So that kind of wraps it up. These are my 3 supplements that I think you should be taking as a strength athlete: creatine, caffeine, and a good multivitamin. If you are interested, I do have to mention I'm sponsored by Bulk Supplements. So you can check out the link down below if you're interested in any of these. Now, with that said, these are very common supplements. You could probably go to your local store and get those. So I just want to convey that as long as you do your diligence and find third-party tested supplements, then any of these should work. But if you want to go down below and support me with that link, please do that. I will also have links to the studies mentioned in this episode. And until next time, please like, subscribe, and comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy lifting.